computer. Okay, so it is a thrill and a treat to have Calvin Tsai visiting all the way from parts unknown, from the South Pole, Antarctica, where I spent many a day, but not many as Calvin. He's going to talk about his adventures in the southernmost continent, Antarctica, wintering over for the Bicep 3 experiment and paying attention to all the upgraded technology that's going down at the South Pole for our friendly competitors, Bicep Array, and also the other activities going there in climate, in understanding the properties of neutrinos, in understanding the atmosphere, all sorts of really cool and interesting stuff. Calvin's a delight. I had him for many years as a research assistant in the lab, plus a student, one of my best students of all time. And it's a thrill that we got to have lunch together and out today. And he's spending some of his time thawing out on a well-deserved vacation to southern San Diego. And Calvin, why don't you take it away, and we'll take questions as they come up. And otherwise, we will stand in frigid attention. Why don't you take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. So I spent 3 seasons at Pole, so that was about 15 months. I just got back last week. I'm going to talk about my experience there, and then mostly just go over pictures and show people what's going on down there. So on this slide here, you see the radomes where we get our internet signal from satellites. There's 3 of them for each of the 3 satellites that we get internet from. And you can see some auroras in the sky, and then the sun's coming up. This is around sunrise in the background there, so the horizon is kind of bright. And the red lights in the distance back there is the main station that's about a mile or so away from the radomes. So I'm going to go over some of the station history, what's going on in the past, and then talk about the current station, which is now the elevated station. Talk a little bit about the current station, and then go over a Bicep overview, and then there'll be a bunch of pictures at the end. I'll talk about those. So at the South Pole, the first people to get there were Amundsen and Scott. They raced from the coast to the pole around 1911, 1912, starting in December, and then they reached pole in January. They used different routes, and then one of the primary differences they also had, and one of the advantages that Amundsen had, was that he used dogs to pull his sleds and supplies, and then Scott used mainly horses and man-hauling. Problem here with horses is that they did not fare very well in the cold. They had sweat glands, and a lot of them died on the way to Antarctica. And then man-hauling made things worse because once they ran out of horses, they had to haul everything on sleds by themselves. So that gave Scott a huge disadvantage, and also he did not bring enough food. And therefore, Amundsen beat Scott by about 34 days. And then on the way back, Scott and some of his men died on the expedition, mainly due to starvation and malnutrition. And then Amundsen had no casualties back to the coast. And then, so when I was at McMurdo Station, which is one of the staging areas for South Pole, I visited the hut that Scott has constructed on the coast before he made his way to the pole. And one of the mistakes he did while he was in McMurdo building this hut was that he bought the hut in Australia, which was meant to vent heat and keep things cool. So so that made things very unpleasant for him when he was starting off the journey. And then, so some of the station history, some of the things that were here before the current station. So looking at the picture on the bottom, you see Amundsen's tent. So he reached the pole in 1911, and then nobody really went back there until U.S. Navy set up a more permanent base, which we call the Navy Station, and that was through Operation Deep Freeze, where they also set up McMurdo. And McMurdo was used as a staging area where they would send planes out of McMurdo to airdrop supplies, buildings, food, whatever, to the people at South Pole. And then, so the Navy ran the South Pole Station for close to 20 years or so, until it was handed off to NSF. And NSF built the dome because they needed more facilities for additional science and other things that were going on with the expanding population. And so after about 30, 40 years of the dome, things got pretty buried because snow just keeps building up. And then eventually it was unfeasible to keep digging out the dome. And then they built an elevated station in 2008, which is currently still there. And then so the dome, after it was decommissioned in 2008, it was disassembled and the rest of it was destroyed by dynamite and buried. So if we go to the next slide, you can see in the picture here, you can see my pointer. The dome is over here. This was before it was blown up by dynamite, before it was buried. And this was the elevated station while it was under construction. In the background here, you'll see what we refer to as the backyard, where a lot of our supplies are left, such as additional parts to repair heavy equipment. All the trash is left there over winter to be picked up and driven out or flown out over summer. Over here, this is what we call a rod well. It's our well. So in order to get fresh water at pole, we drill down to the ice, pump in hot water, that melts the ice, and then we pump out more of the cold water that was melted. And then so we don't use all of the water that's pumped out. So it's reheated and sent back down to the hole where it melts more ice. And then so we have a continuous source of water. So this station called Elevated Station supports up to about 200 staff during summer. And then during winter, my winter, there were 39 people who wintered over. Usually it's about 40 or 50. And then so we had the smallest population since 1998. And then one of the highest populations was about 80 or so people in the early 2000s when they were building the elevated station. The station is uniquely shaped. It's an airfoil shape, so the wind usually blows in this direction towards the backyard. And so the airfoil shape clears out the snow from underneath the station, prevents it from building up. The problem is now that there's a wall of snow on this side of the station that has to be continually bulldozed down and then driven out. The station is built on stilts and has the ability to be jacked up. Ironically, they lost the plans on how to jack up the station, so they don't know how to jack up the station. And they're supposed to jack up the station within the next year or two because it's about to get buried. And then they're going to try it out on some other buildings first before they jack up the main station. So some statistics for 2021, when I wintered,
Calvin, was the you're saying the main station where we sleep is going to be buried?
The snow's getting pretty high, so they're doing a lot of work to groom it, but they're going to have to jack it up soon, otherwise it's going to get buried.
You mean raise it? It's on stilts, it's on jacks already, but they have to raise it up is what you're saying.
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
And so mention the population, and then the average temperature was negative 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which was the coldest average temperature ever at South Pole. And then the coldest it ever got was negative 112 Fahrenheit, and with wind chill that became negative 165. And then during summer, temperatures average between 0 to negative 40 Fahrenheit. And then so during the winter, it's too cold for us to run most of the heavy equipment. You can't run snowmobiles, planes can't fly in. So we're isolated during winter. And then during summer, they had to fly in all the supplies, like the food, the fuel, all the science equipment we need, and they have to prep the station for the upcoming winter. So at Pole, one of the science sectors is called the dark sector. Contains 3 buildings, DSL, Maple, and ICL. So DSL is the dark sector lab. It hosts South Pole Telescope and Bicep 3. It's a building on the left and a picture on the bottom. So there's Bicep 3 here and SPT over here. There's a hallway that links SPT to Bicep 3, and we share the interior space for our computers. And then Maple is the building on the right here. It's the Martin A. Pomerantz Observatory. And then Bicep Array is this big dish over here. There's a machine shop on the first floor. So a Bicep Array shares the space with the machinist. And we have 1 machinist for the winter. ICL is the Ice Cube Lab. It is going to be off in the distance on the left here, not pictured, but it hosts the computer and the storage space for Ice Cube, which is a neutrino observatory. So Ice Cube is a special kind of telescope. Layer detectors are buried underneath the ice. So when they drill, they bring a big team, drill about a mile to a mile and a half underneath the ice, and then they put in their detectors. And then the ice at Pole is especially good for observing neutrinos. So that's why their experiment is located at Pole. And then for the other CMB telescopes here, we are at Pole because high altitude, cold, low atmosphere, and our same patch of sky is always above us. So the patch of sky never goes down that we're observing. And then so during winter, which is our main observing season, our telescopes are operating all the time unless we're cycling the fridge. So other science sectors at Pole include the quiet sector and clean air sector. Quiet sector is for monitoring seismic activity. So if you drive a snowmobile or a tractor, or you walk over into the science sector or into the quiet sector, they will pick it up on their detectors. So it's very sensitive, and it's pretty much closed off unless someone has to go service some equipment out there. And then there's a clean air sector, which is where a building called Aero is hosted. Aero is run by NOAA scientists. They monitor the climate and then look at things such as ozone, pollution, things like that. And their Aero is downwind of a area where tractors, heavy equipment, anything that could cause pollution is not allowed to drive over to keep the air as clean as possible. And this picture was taken during sunset, right before the sun went down. So sunset and sunrise at Pole takes a span of 2 weeks each. So the sky will look like this for about 2 weeks before the sun goes all the way down or rises all the way up. So I'm only gonna go into.
You see the green flash at
all? I didn't see it personally. My friend took a picture of it and I saw it. So during sunrise, my friend and I were actually the first people to see the sun come up because it was in the middle of the night, and my friend and I were up and we saw the sun come up, and it was glorious.
Oh, is this a real friend, Calvin?
I'm sure I wasn't talking to myself. Okay, moving on to Bicep Overview. So Bicep does low L science, does degree scale measurements, pretty much only looks at CMB to look for primordial B modes, doesn't really do any of the other science that people like SPT or polar bear or SO would be able to do. So they use wide field refracting telescopes with antenna, a couple TES bolometers. So same TES bolometers as what everybody else uses in the CMB field, but they use small refracting telescopes, kind of like what SO is doing with their SATs. And then because of this, we're unable to do lensing, so there are plans to work with SPT, use SPT data for delensing, and that's upcoming in future papers. Picture on the right is a timescale of various Bicep experiments from Bicep 2, which Brian worked on, up to Bicep Array. And then so top is the picture of the telescope, middle is what detectors look like, and the bottom is a theoretical picture of what detector tiles would look like. So let's start over here on the bottom left. So Bicep 2 used 4 4-inch wafers. Keck Array expanded on that with 5 Bicep 2 style receivers, each with its own focal plane of 4 4-inch wafers. Bicep 3 was larger and it could accommodate 21 4-inch wafers. You can see a slot is missing here, and I know everybody will ask why there's a slot missing here. And the answer to that is that with TDM, which is the readout scheme that Bicep uses, there was not enough readout to read out an extra detector wafer there, so it was left blank. And so Bicep 3 is still observing. This was the telescope I was overseeing during my winter at Pole. And then Bicep Array deployed in 2019. And then 2020 was his first observing season. And that was the other telescope I was working with. There was another winter over I worked with who ran Bicep Array. So with Bicep Array, they moved from 4-inch to 6-inch wafers, same focal plane size, but with larger tiles, they got rid of a lot of the edges that the 4-inch wafers would have had. And the first Bicep Array receiver that was deployed was BA1, which was the low frequency receiver. And then there's also 3 Keck receivers in there while the other Bicep Array receivers are being prepared. So Bicep 3, deployed in 2015, observes at 1 frequency, 95 gigahertz. At that time, the diplexer detectors were not available yet, so it was single frequency, single band. Has about 2,500 bolometers, and then I made a mistake earlier saying 21 tiles. It's actually 20 tiles, about 128 bolometers each. And like I said, we're missing a tile because we do not have the multiplexing for the additional tile. And then so the TDM multiplexing is done with the MCE crates, which is the warm readout mechanic of TDM. And then it is mounted on the same mount that was used for Bicep 1 and Bicep 2 with minor modifications. Picture on the right, there is inside Dark Sector Lab. The telescope is in the center of the picture, and then my workstation is at the bottom. You can see it's a fairly small telescope. It pokes its head through the ceiling, and then there's a ground shield that I will show later that protects it from ground reflections.
Was this tiny little monitor on the right side of the?
That is John's little star camera TV that he refuses to let me throw away. It is this horrible little horrible little black and white monitor we use for doing star pointing. So Bicep doesn't have the resolution to see planets and that kind of stuff. So we have to have an optical camera to make our pointing model. And then, but for Bicep Array, that the star pointing is automated. You run the schedule for doing star pointing, but in Bicep 3, it's all manual. You have to start the star pointing schedule and then manually click to let the telescope track where the star is. Once it's centered, you move on to the next star, and it's a process that takes about 3 hours each time. And the next thing is I'm going to talk about is Bicep Array, which is Bicep's newer telescope, new experiment. It's a completely new mount, replaced the Daisy Spud and Keck mount. And it was designed to hold the larger weight of Bicep Array and its 4 receivers. First receiver that was deployed was BA1, low frequency, 3040 gigahertz. And then we also used these things called helium rotary joints, which is what these things here. They allow us to move in 360 degrees in azimuth stage and our Borsai stage. And we don't have to use helium cable wraps. So the way it works is that there's a bottom section here where you can plug in all your helium lines, and the top has all these channels and grooves that isolate the channels from each other and allow helium to go into the correct fitting, and then you can pipe it wherever it needs to go, which is the receivers. So that was the new technology developed by DSTI for Bicep Array, specifically for helium, which was unprecedented because it's very hard to make something like this for helium because it is leaky generally. They designed this for us, and so far so good. It has performed very well, much better than how cable wraps would have performed. And then Bicep Array plans to deploy 2 9150 receivers and then a 22270 receiver. This year, the plan is to deploy 1 9150 receiver that's currently at Caltech. we were supposed to deploy last year, but due to COVID restraints, we could not get a cargo space on a plane going to Pole to deploy a receiver. So with Bicep Array fully deployed, it would be looking at about 30,000 plus detectors. We are able to fit this many detectors because moving up from 6-inch from the 4-inch tiles gave us more room by neglecting the edges. And then picture on the right, the top picture here is during sunset in 2020. Picture of Nathan, who was our 2020 winter over. That was the first observing season for Bicep Array after it was assembled and calibrated at Pole. You see there's a big dish surrounding the telescope, kind of like the ground shield for ACT. Just prevents ground reflections, but also collects a lot of snow. So we have to shovel it out basically every other day. Picture on the bottom shows cutaways of Bicep Array, what the receiver looks like, and what the detectors look like. So learning from how Bicep 3 was built, they improved on Bicep Array with a very similar design, but it became very easy to assemble and disassemble the receiver. Basically, the 300K and 50K shells will lift off and you are exposed to the focal plane. So the whole process of taking apart, putting together a receiver takes about a day or less. So that was the gist of the things I want to talk about. The rest of the slides are just a picture dump of a bunch of pictures from my friends, pictures I found on the USAP website, or pictures I took. So I believe this was sunrise. So this was the ceremonial pole marker. There's 12 flags here, each of them representing a country that signed the Antarctic Treaty. So Antarctic Treaty talks about things like no weapons testing, no military, don't harm the wildlife, no pollution, that kind of stuff. So 12 countries signed this treaty, and so these are 12 flags represented here. The sun is rising on the right over here. That's why you see the bright spot on the right. And in the tower in the back over there is the aero tower, which is used for collecting air samples. This is taken by my friend around Midwinter, which was in June. So Midwinter is basically the most important holiday for Polies. It is our Christmas. It is the middle of the winter, and it means that we are halfway done, and we are closer to getting out of there. So you can see really nice auroras. This picture is overexposed, but so generally they won't look as bright as that, but sometimes they do. The auroras vary in color. Typically, green, purple, and red are very common. Sometimes you get this kind of aurora, which is streaky. They look like lines and they dance around in the sky and move a lot. And then there's another kind, which is lumpier. They kind of look like clouds. If you're not paying attention, they look like clouds. Those don't move around them as much and they don't really change color. Picture here is the geographic pole marker, which is different from the ceremonial pole marker. Surveyor comes out every year, and then because the ice sheet moves at pole, they have to survey where the actual geographic pole is, and it shifts about 30 feet every year. And then the winter overs from the previous year will design what the pole marker looks like for next year, and that pole marker will designate the geographic south pole for the next year. It is this pole hidden behind the sign right here. And then so as the 2020 winter over, our station designed the geographic south pole marker that is currently up. It was put up January 1st, 2022, and will be up until January 1st of next year when a new one is put in. And then you see a bunch of flags in the picture. So during winter, we're not allowed to have white lights on outside because it affects the aurora cameras, some of the science experiments going on. So we have to use red lights, headlamps, and we use the flags to go where we need to go. So there's a flag line going out to DSL. If it did not exist, I would probably have gone lost several times. So flags are super helpful. They let you know where you need to go when it's super dark for 6 months. This is another picture my friend took, more auroras. There's the station down there. You can see the Milky Way in the background. Probably noticed that the ground is very flat, and you can see pretty far. That is how it is at pole. It is basically a plateau of ice that is 2 miles thick, and there's no features. There are no mountains, no canyons, nothing but flat for miles and miles and miles. There's a main station here. This is where our galley would be. So this would be where we eat our meals, and then offices, and the main station science lab is in this section of the station. And then this is what we call a beer can, because it looks like a beer can. You go down several stories and you will enter where our power plant is, where vehicle maintenance facility is, and where a lot of our supplies like fuel and food are stored. So things are stored underground just because it's colder down there and temperatures are more stable than if we put them outside. This picture I took of Biceps 3 during sunrise. So at about a day or two after sunrise, I went out to dark sector lab and took this picture. You can see this is the ground chia for Bicep 3, similar to Bicep arrays, but smaller. Bicep 3 is inside there. There is a hatch over here that I can open to go inside to do all the work I need to. This is the first plane landing at pole after winter. First plane arrived, I think mid-September. It was on a deployment flight on the way to McMurdo from a British station on the coast. This type of plane is called a Basler. It is a modified DC-3. Company that operates these planes in Antarctica is called Camboric Air, or KBA for short. They are the primary company for operating flights in and out of pole, besides the U.S. Air Guard. So KBA flies these Baslers. They're mainly used for passenger transport. They're not really big enough for cargo. And then the Air Guard runs C-130s and LC-130s, and these are big cargo planes with skis, and they can land at pole because they're skis. We don't have an actual runway, so any plane that lands here has to land on skis. And during winter, it's too cold for most planes to land. So anything with hydraulics is not able to land during winter. So if there was a medevac during winter, they have to bring in a plane called the Twin Otter, which is really little and pretty old, doesn't have any hydraulics, so it's able to land during winter. So even a plane like this Basler won't be able to land during winter. So the first summer I was there in 2020, there was COVID, and they were paranoid that bringing a lot of flights into station would cause COVID to have an outbreak. So they limited flights to only these Baslers, and then everything else was driven in by tractor. It takes about 2 weeks or more for people to drive from McMurdo to pole to deliver fuel and food. And then it's about another 2 weeks to get back to McMurdo. During this past summer of 2021, we were able to bring in a few LC-130s, and that resupply the station with food, fuel, and then some of the science cargo we need to calibrate Bicep array. The flags here are for visibility reasons. The meteorologist on station uses these to gauge the weather, and then the pilots also use these to gauge how much runway they have left when they're landing. And then the meteorologist also does weather balloon launches about once or twice a day, more if a plane is landing. So this was at sunrise, so it's a weather balloon. These are non-recoverable for the most part. They launch it, they get the data, balloon pops, it falls back down to Earth, and then that's the end of that. Sometimes they'll launch instruments that have to be recovered, and then they'll go on a snowmobile, and usually the balloon is about a mile or two away from station to recover. This was the eclipse in December. So this is a bunch of images stacked on top of each other. One of my friends took this. It made its way around the internet, so some of you might have seen this. But we got a 90% totality eclipse at pole in December this past year. And so we can see the temperature drop. It got dark at pole. You can see how the sun is almost totally eclipsed here by the moon. And then there's SPT down there. You can see Bicep 3. Yeah, this is a cool picture. I like it a lot. And then picture credits. So Jeff Keller, he was one of the control engineers. And Nathan Precup, he was a BA winter over past year. Among was this current year's SPT winter over. And I got some pictures from the Bicep Kite collaboration and also from USAP. USAP stands for United States Antarctic Program. So thanks for listening to my talk. This is a picture of this past summer's Bicep crew, where we had to service the Bicep Array telescope.
Awesome. Great. So I have some questions, but let me open it to other people first. Any questions? Just unmute. What's it like, the physical tests, psychological tests, etc., to get to the pole? How competitive is it, and what hoops do you have to jump through?
So for the medical exam, it's a full physical check. They want to make sure you don't have any issues that will come up. And with COVID, they put an age requirement and got stricter on being overweight and high blood pressure and things like that. So that disqualified a lot of the veterans from coming back that have been coming for years, because some of them were getting old and weren't allowed back because of the new COVID restrictions. You also had to get a dental exam and then blood test done and get a bunch of other vaccinations, just so you don't bring in some kind of disease. Make sure you don't have any blood issues. Make sure you won't have any dental problems. They also brought in a dentist right before winter just to check everybody's teeth and give everybody a cleanup before winter started. And then over winter, there's one doctor and one PA on station. And so if there's a problem, at least there is somebody there that can help you. For a psychological test, they got rid of that a few years ago and it replaced it with team building events. So we did team building over Zoom because usually they would meet in Estes Park and then do team building there. But with COVID in 2020, we weren't allowed to meet in Estes Park, so it was all over Zoom.
Okay.
Brian, Sean Casey, I have a question.
Sure.
Calvin, for the Bicep experiment, what is the typical observing efficiency down at the pole? If you take the time that's available and how much of that actually gets converted into science time for the CMB experiments down there?
Yeah, so during summer is when we service our telescopes because we can bring in science equipment, bring in calibration equipment. So this past summer, Bicep Array and Bicep 3 were calibrating, and so we didn't do any science observations. But during winter, Bicep 3 and Bicep Array are observing full time. We're only stopping observations if there's a problem. And so for Bicep 3, we run on a 72-hour schedule where we observe for 66 hours and then cycle the fridge for 6 hours, and that's continuous. So every 72 hours, there is a 6-hour downtime to cycle the fridge, and that's it. And that's the time we use to go into the mountain, go into the ground sheet, clean out the snow, service what we need to service. And then once those 6 hours up, the telescope starts observing again. For Bicep Array, it's a little different. Bicep Array has the capability to do a 72-hour hold time, but we're limited by the Keck receivers, which are older and only have a 48-hour hold time. So same thing, minus a day for Bicep Array.
Mm-hmm. And then you're observing as soon as the pole shuts down, or how does that work? What's the observing schedule? I mean, is it officially at winter, or, if you look at 365 days out of the year?
Yeah, so winter is technically starts as soon as it gets too cold and last plane leaves, and summer begins when the first plane arrives. So typically, last plane leaves mid-February. So pole right now, the last plane is about to leave, and we got our first plane in after winter about mid-September. And so we're observing all the time unless we're calibrating or unless there's downtime to fix the telescope. So the summer before this one, we were observing the whole time because we weren't calibrating the instrument during summer. But during summer, the data isn't very good because sky temperature fluctuates because the sun is up. So we don't typically make it a point to observe during summer. We use that time to service the telescope because winter data is much better and the sky temperature is much more stable.
Okay, hey, thank you, Calvin. Great talk too, thank you.
Thank you.
That's from a former pole inhabitant himself, Dr. Sean Casey. Any other questions for Calvin or comments? If not, I'll go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I've got two. First, have you ever seen The Thing?
Yeah. There's a tradition at Pole where we watch all three of the Thing movies as soon as the last plane leaves in February.
That's awesome. And then I guess the other question was, how far can you guys like explore on the site? Like, I assume there's like a safe area, like perimeter that they don't want you to go past because it's dangerous to go walking outside of that. I was just curious how far you can go.
Yeah, about 2 miles is what they tell us. Within radio range is what they want us to be in. There's an attenuator for our radio system so that the signal doesn't contaminate the CMB telescopes. There's a point on station called End of the World, which is the end of the backyard. So let me go back a few slides. Yeah. So End of the World is about this marker over here, and that is the end of the backyard. And there is a hut there. You can sign your name if you make it to the end of the world, and that is theoretically as far as you really should be going.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Sure.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Calvin. That's been awesome. I'm going to stop the recording here.